Thank you very much and welcome everybody. I'm Alfredo Cramerotti, Director here at MOSTYN, and I have Shezad Dawood and Mike Perry, who are the two artists featured in the double act exhibitions and that we put together actually. The idea for the talk was really to have a sense where your practice come from, in a way, for the audience who doesn't specifically know about your work, and maybe later talk about some of the overlaps between your two practices. You realize yourself once you've been put together in a way, weird dream, and there are a few actually of them as well. So I would ask actually maybe Shezad to. Can you just give us a sense how you started your journey up to here? I mean, I don't want the whole biography. I just want actually the main interest, for instance, about the issues of migration, mental health, and marine welfare. How did you get to this point actually to embark in this Leviathan 3 years massive project that it's everyone else will be scared to do it. And
well, thank you, Alfredo. Thank you all for being here. I think I'm sort of quite scared of this project. It's kind of every so often I think as an artist you step into a territory that's much bigger than you imagined and just puts so much more responsibility on you than you ever anticipated taking on. The whole Leviathan project, it actually started, I was working on two separate areas of research. I was doing a lot of research around ideas of democracy, both in the contemporary sense, but also the historical sense. And in parallel, I was becoming more and more interested I'd always been interested in the ocean as a space, because it's sort of, I think the ocean, like the unconscious, is a space we don't see, we kind of largely ignore as we go on about our daily lives, but it's such a repository for our creativity, that whole sort of 9/10 of the iceberg that you don't see. There was a sort of moment, probably about 2015-16, where obviously newspapers, journalism was all talking about refugees and migrants moving or fleeing by sea. And I just started to kind of imagine what could be the connection, if any, between what was happening below the surface of the sea and all these journeys taken under duress on the surface of the sea. And interestingly, I started speaking to different oceanographers and other sort of marine-related scientists, saying, hello, this is sort of where you go in as an artist to speak to experts, slightly kind of embarrassed and slightly awkward, and you say, I've been thinking that there might be some sort of connection between what's happening on the surface of the sea and what's happening beneath the sea, and you half expect them to laugh you out of the room. And I remember I walked into this room of academics, and I was so nervous, and then they all were sort of almost fighting each other to talk to me about this subject. And obviously it had been really kind of motivating them. And one of the things that I've since found is how hard it is for scientists to get their research and their ideas out, into the sort of larger public consciousness. And it turned out, much to my surprise, and I'll just give this key example, that there's a hump on the seabed in the Mediterranean, which is pretty much halfway on the Lampedusa crossing from North Africa to Sicily. And this sort of hump or vent, basically with warming waters, as they're sort of displaced from the eastern Mediterranean to the western Mediterranean, they heat up and pass over this hump and then go down again. And what that does is it creates the riptides and the currents that make that such a dangerous crossing. So this was a kind of, I remember just the hairs on my neck standing up on end, because I wasn't expecting such a direct physical connection between these two realities, from the seabed to the sea surface. And it got me I suddenly realised, I sort of went back to my research on democracy, where I was thinking a lot about people like Thomas Hobbes and Jonathan Swift and how they talked about democracy, specifically historically in this country, with relation to the sea. So both Hobbes and Swift talked about Leviathan, this sort of giant sea creature, as a sort of metaphor for the state and its sort of unforgiving weight on the people. And, you know, Swift kind of satirized it even more. The main sculpture in there is actually a sculptural sort of update of some of the period illustrations for Swift's first published work called A Tale of a Tub. And A Tale of a Tub is a sort of allegory where you know, a bunch of sailors in a rowboat who represent society or community, you know, so us in a sense, are kind of desperately trying not to have their boats smashed in by the whale, which is the state. And to sort of distract the whale, they throw over tubs, which were just, you know, it's 18th century, 17th century slang for a barrel. They throw over these barrels representing their labour or capital to distract the whale. And, you know, a lot has been written about sort of injustice and inequity, but interestingly, in reading statistics, it's sort of in recent years we've got to a similar level of wealth inequity as in Swift's day when he wrote that pamphlet. I was just suddenly like, you know, that light bulb thing where this is all connected. It's not just the sea bottom and the sea surface, but the whole idea of democracy and the sort of allegory of the sea used by some of the earliest.
It's not just about space; it's also about time.
Time and thought and society, and I was just like, you know, what have I done? And obviously now I'm stuck with this project, which seems to be getting bigger all the time, and each person I speak to on the journey challenges my assumptions, and I feel like I have to find new ways to share this material. So it's quite a bed I've made for myself.
Thank you. Mike, for you, what is your journey to come to what we see in the gallery here? What was it? Or
my dad,
is it still?
My father was a scientist, biochemist, professor of biochemistry. My mother was a painter, an artist.
Nice.
And I think somewhere in the work that I'm doing, there's a bit of both. But my childhood, my early years I was left alone on the beach of West Wales. Just my dad was marking papers, my mum was painting. And I'd be picking up things, and my dad would shout out the chemical reaction of how that mussel worked or that fish would swim or anything, but I was actually more interested in how it looked, you know, towards my mother's side. But my father was the sort of boss of the family, that generation, and I ended up reading economics. I ended up doing a postgraduate in economics, and I went into business and communications. And 10 years later, I found myself in London and having a company. We were management consultants, and I started getting involved with Greenpeace and environmental groups more and more. And I realised that my passion, every holiday I was out taking photographs. Every spare second, the weekend, during the night, I'd be in the darkroom, you know, listening to. I could name all the pork belly prices, 6 o'clock in the morning, because I'd be in my darkroom. But to cut a long story short, I got to an age, thought, what am I doing in my life? I want to be an artist. So I said, that's it. And I moved back to West Wales. I bought a deserted farm right by the sea, which happens to be where they shot Moby Dick.
Which was the first of the lab we noticed.
We'll come back to that. But when I got to this farm and I set up a studio, I thought, God, that's it, I'm an artist now. Pembrokeshire's in this national park, and there are 2 bodies of work in the show, and both bodies required a different sort of process. One was about the national parks, which is called wet deserts, the large photographic landscapes. And I was very aware from my work in Greenpeace that most of our national parks, far from being beautiful, they're dead. Their biodiversity dead. They're the result of sheep farming, several hundred years of sheep farming. Nothing grows. You can walk for hours in our national parks and not even hear a bird song. And this is the great myth. The Pembrokeshire National Park is beautiful, but the land, everyone looks at the sea, the land is dead. So I took a few pictures, and that ended up being rather like kind of romantic paintings of the 18th century, so the sublime. I'm thinking actually there's a new sublime here, which is not nature as horror, but what we've done for the land, the emptiness of it. So I thought, there's something in this. So I thought, I'm going to go to other national parks. So hired a camper van and went to Scotland and Ireland, and in the middle of winter, bleak, rain, driving rain, and I realised that the national parks are saying there, if they're not just barren from deer grazing or sheep or mismanagement through wealthy estates in Scotland, and that these places of beauty, as the tourist brochures say, you know, the wild nature, actually they're dead land and they're low biodiversity and they're being mismanaged. So that's what that body of work was, and that involved me using photography, which was the medium that I'd sort of grown up loving and was very passionate about. And it was me making work that also had an environmental narrative. The other body of work, the more plastic, was this farm that I bought actually had this sort of slate, rough beach down the bottom. And I go down, walk the dog every evening, and I, you know, started seeing plastic emerging everywhere. And I started recording it with a little baby camera and putting it in a book. I thought, God, I'm turning into my father, you know, as a natural history, you know. It became like a natural history thing. The truth is, I got bored. I had hundreds of them, but I didn't want to have mass collections, you know. That's what natural history people do. I was interested in the beauty of these pieces, even though they were kind of toxic. I still found them very beautiful, and so I was picking up this rubbish, and then I started photographing them in much more detail, and then I realized I found something, which is this idea that you can turn this rubbish into something that has an aesthetic quality, and the kind of ambiguity there was my kind of strategy in a way of approaching the subject of pollution. So I guess my journey was not from art school. There weren't art school strategies. They were from me having two strong backgrounds and eventually finding myself as an artist, and two kind of different bodies of work. But as an artist friend of mine said, you know, when she looked at my small plastic photographs, I said, these are landscapes. They're kind of micro landscapes, but they're landscapes of the nature on the man-made rather than man and nature, which is what I was doing previously. So. And then these guys at MOSTYN said, okay, we want to put your landscapes on top of the plastic work. I said, no, you can't do that, no. Got to be a separate room, there's different works. And actually, I thought it worked really, really nicely because it makes you think about how we represent the landscape. Two very different approaches. So,
Thank you. You touch on the Moby Dick location.
Sorry.
And I think it's, now is the time to reveal it. So the first, when they met, actually, because we were installing the shows, actually, just talking really. And you were talking about your Moby Dick little sculpture. And Mike said, well, actually, you know, I live where they shot that one. Which was really a bizarre coincidence, actually.
Well, the beach that I was collecting the plastic, a lot of those shoes are from, is where Gregory Peck, we call our bathroom now the Gregory Peck bathroom, because apparently he used it once. It's where he'd go out in the rubber dinghy, you know, and they'd shoot. John Huston was on the cliffs, directing the whale scenes and everything, and then I walked in and saw you know, this Moby Dick got these connections, and then there's other connections. This picture we'll talk about in a second, but the Moby Dick thing was really interesting. So,
and for you, the Moby Dick?
I mean, for me, you know, interestingly, I mean, this project, you know, started in Venice last year. It's due to tour to I don't know how many places, but the smallest piece in the exhibition is the title piece, which I quite like. That it's called Leviathan, and it's just very dinky, and it's a sort of mixture of things. It's partly a reference to a 17th century Dutch painting of a beached whale in Katowice, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, by Isaias van der Velde, combined with this sort of tiny detailed figure of Gregory Peck playing Ahab, sort of strapped to the whale at the end. You know, they both go to their death and their doom. And that sort of bombast, I mean, Moby Dick is probably one of my favourite books, even before I got onto this whole topic, and that's probably one of my favourite films. And in fact, you know, my wife and I and our daughter actually, you know, I dragged them all to Fishguard to make a pilgrimage to the ship pub in Fishguard, where they actually still have a lot of the production stills because it was shot. A lot of the film was shot there.
I've been very drunk in that pub many times.
But we realise there's a connection, obviously, to our interests, but also there's a very Welsh kind of rootedness to. So it's really kind of perfect that we're, you know, all here together. But for me, I suppose, Moby Dick, that idea of, the whale and Ahab entangled in death together, I think for me it was sort of bringing us back to this fact that we are entangled with this ecosystem. We're not separate from it. We live or die by it, by its grace, not vice versa as we sometimes think. So for me, that was also why I wanted that little sculpture to sort of be the title piece. So I think because you don't always need something large to speak loudest.
And there's also that thing with going whaling or going out to sea, conjures up all sort of romantic visions of people trying to find themselves, going off to sea, the famous Sea Fever, poem and piece of music, 1913. And now, when I walk down to the beach in the evening, there's a sense of melancholy in me. I can't look at the sea now. As a kid, this was wondrous, amazing. But now I have this sense of feeling that I know how polluted it is. I know that there's plastic in there. I know there's no fish there anymore. And so there's that whole thing within a period of 200 years, it's sort of circular, which is now what was a romantic, vision or place to discover what there is now. Sort of horror stories of a different kind are coming in.
It's also to sort of start to understand how implicit we are with the sea. One of the books I've very much enjoyed as part of my research was Philip Hoare's Leviathan, and I've had the good fortune to sit down and chat with Philip himself. But he talks about, he sort of somehow manages to weave in our at times brutal and destructive whaling history, which to my mind is a sort of precursor of what we're doing to the oceans now. It's not like human stewardship has ever been particularly benign. I think it's sort of benign by accident when we're removed from the equation. With, say, new marine protected zones. There's some research I'm doing down in Plymouth, and we've both worked in Plymouth. And the Marine Institute there have created a whole marine protected zone, an MPZ, and those are being rolled out as sort of experimentally in different sites around the world at the moment. And we were talking just over lunch. I think we put us two in a room, we discovered, and we don't stop talking, do we? There's that many interests in common.
Yeah, the Plymouth is also an interesting connection, because actually Mike just showed in Plymouth, and Leviathan is going to Plymouth actually. So that's really from two different routes, really, but they just come together naturally, somehow organically. I was wondering one thing actually, you just touched upon it, but what role does it play, the apocalyptic, in your respective work as a concept, as an idea?
Well, I think there is around the world at the moment, a sort of mass sense of, fear, really, what's going on in many areas, both politically but also with the environment. And I think the more people are involved with climate change and the sea, and it's a challenge because it's such a huge task. It's how, as an artist, do you take on such a big issue? And I think the result is that so many people aren't reacting to the problems because the task looks so good. And if we do anything, if we march, it won't do anything. 1 million people marched, for Iraq. Why bother? So I think one of the problems with this sense of apocalyptic problems of environment, which I fear and have every day living in nature, is that it's very hard to know what to do, because and I suppose it's a sense of hope in you and optimism that you do something, even if it's on a small scale. And I've been planting little areas of the farm, rewilding them. I just put a sedum roof on my studio the other day, and there were 800 bees on the first day when the flowers came. I thought, my God, we can change the world, because if everyone does things on a small scale, maybe that's the way back, because the big institutions, United Nations is crumbling, the governments aren't, it's crumbling, Europe's crumbling. So I think my response really to your question is, I think the only hope with this apocalyptic nature of things is that enough green shoots come up, and artists can do that in their own little way. But that's all we can do. It's very hard to think we can change the world, because I don't think art has ever changed the world. Artists reflect the horrors, but Guernica didn't stop the Spanish Civil War.
You did changes with the roof. Flower.
Well, but on a small scale,
small scale.
and. So
it's more about something that kind of drives you, the idea of the apocalyptic?
Well, that's again is a difficult thing because a lot of people at various gallery tours have said, is it the environmental thing that drives you or is it the art thing? And the truth is the art thing. And I'd be lying if I said I'm doing this to change the world. You know, when I pick those things up on the beach, I just, you know, I find them really beautiful. And it just happens to be I'm very concerned about the environment and whatever, and I want my work to have some narrative just beyond pure abstraction. But the truth is nature's going to go on doing its thing, whether we humans are here or not. If we're stupid enough to screw it up, then that's our fault. But nature's going to be doing its thing, and I'm driven by, you know, need for the concept of alchemy, turning something mundane and giving it some significance that might create emotional change. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
For you, Shezad, the idea of the apocalyptic?
I mean, I guess I'd be lying if I didn't say that I've always been fascinated by the apocalyptic. You know, it's about that sort of dark, unexamined space of the unconscious that I think is always with us. But
especially in your films.
In my films, I think my films and my writing, it goes.
Yeah. Parallel, yeah.
But equally, you know, it's been an interesting journey this last few years around Leviathan because I'm naturally, you know, on the flip side of this fascination with the apocalyptic, I'm also quite an optimist. I'm quite a kind of hopeful idealist, you know. I'm probably the naive fool who does think he's going to change the world, you know. I probably really believe that, even if everyone around me kind of, you know, thinks, okay, we'll just humour him. And, you know, I guess with this project, I really thought that it felt important to sort of deal with these subjects. I suppose there is this sort of, maybe I find it harder to separate the art and the ethics, but, you know, there was this sort of, you know, when I had the light bulb and I started to sort of bring together the ideas of democracy that I was interested in kind of, you know, looking at, and the ideas of the sea, it was like, this is a really important kind of realization, and there is something to be done here. You know, with talks like today, but we did a number of talks in Venice. The idea is to have a whole program of public talks in every city and country this goes to over the next few years. And there is a dedicated Leviathan website where a lot of the talks we've asked people to do short, accessible written papers as written equivalents of their talks, so that people can you know, it's not just for the 20, 30 people in a room, but many more people can read it. But somebody who's maybe seen a talk here, or might see one in Canada or wherever, can then go, oh, I'm interested to read some more. And also the talks we're doing is, you know, in some cases it's a mixture of marine scientists, migrant rights activists, economists, others. And for me, it's been a real journey of discovery to make links between subjects that are not at first obvious. And I think one of the kind of, you know, and I suppose part of it has been, you know, I think as you said, Mike, I've struggled over the last couple. My optimism has actually been really, really knocked. You know, pretty much 90% of the conversations I've had for research for this project make me come out slightly crestfallen. I go in looking for something to hang on to, and I come out with less to hang on to, because the situation appears bleak. There's a lot of elephants in the room, you know. A lot of people have said things to me off the record, and I'm like, why won't you say that on the record? And I think you realise that even scientists have to get funding. So they can't, you know, there's vested interests all over the place. So, you know, one of the biggest issues that nobody's talking about is population. And population goes hand in hand with the need to consume that's in our current sort of neoliberal capitalist model, that if there's not population continually coming through, nobody will buy the shit, then we won't have any manufacturing to make the shit, then we won't have any companies who get money to dispose of the shit, however imperfectly, and imperfectly is a polite term. And, you know, and if we don't keep repopulating, who will look after the old people and fund their pensions? By continually feeding into the mince grinder, and you're like, this system is really, really insane. And we're all somehow living it by choosing to just go on about our day slightly blinkered. And at what point, you know, but obviously, as you said as well, it's a sort of, it seems like a mammoth, impossible task to rewrite the rules. And you know, also because when you start to look at it, because I used to kind of naively think, but it's just about changing legislation so they can't get away with half of this stuff. And then you realise, well, the politicians are kind of, you know, straitjacketed by donations and whatever. It needs a radical overhaul. And then are we as a people ready to kind of campaign for that, stand up for that?
George Monbiot talks about this idea of the baseline syndrome, which is that kids growing up now look at nature and think that's how it always was. So, for example, when I was a teenager, I remember when I was climbing up the cliffs and the noise of seagulls on the cliffs was deafening, and I used to be climbing and they'd be attacking me and everything. And when I go down to the beach now, it's totally quiet. It's like a morgue. There's 1 or 2 seagulls. And then I read that the RSPB had just come out with these figures, which is 76% of seabirds have disappeared since 1970. And 1970 was when I was a little kid on this beach. So just in our lifetime, our generation, it's massively changed. But to people growing up now, those cliffs, they're bare. That's how normally how it should be. And those empty sheep fields, land with no biodiversity, that's normal nature. And he talks about this as being a problem because only certain groups feel apocalyptic. The scientists who are desperate looking at the figures, Murdoch Press won't publish them, you know, artists will take and go and do their own things. How do we tell the world about that? But it's not everybody feels this apocalyptic. I think it's those who are educated in the broader sense, just in terms of, are just aware of it. But masses of people carry on and aren't aware of it. Plus, BBC and, you know, when you do a mainstream TV on plastics, for example, the impact that has huge. It requires something massive like that to make a difference. So,
what's the role? I'm just thinking. We were talking actually before about this kind of idea of mass anxiety and the idea of the mental health effect on this, if you want, apocalyptic scenario or anyway of this kind of a journeys. And I was wondering, how you feel about it and what role plays into your work, actually, this psychological dimension.
My wife was talking about, she's a psychologist, she's talking this idea of this mass anxiety, people, you know, feeling, you know, after Brexit, I remember about a week, I'd wake up and my teeth were clenched, you know, and then when you see the science on climate change, but particularly plastics, 15 years ago, I'd go down the beach and pick up some mussels, go and get a fish, and now I'm told by head marine biologist at Plymouth that he doesn't feed his children fish anymore. I think, you know, so there is, I know, when I'm walking around the farm, planting, treating things, this sense in my head of how long is this going to go on, are we going to, you know, what can we do about it? And groups of my friends feel very similar, and there's this anxiety, and I find every phone call we're having with each other goes on how bad it is. We make ourselves feel even worse, you know, we talk about it. You come off the phone and go, oh God, I feel worse. I just spoke to my best friend. So how do we get out of it? I mean, how did they get out of it in the 30s, you know, in America? How did they get out after the war? You know, what, do we need a renaissance? Do we need horror, pure horror, before we start recognizing, you know, the value in nature and the value in communication across the world and everything? I don't know, but we're at that stage where it would be lovely to think we can cure this mass anxiety by, it's not going to come from democratic action, at least in the short term. It doesn't look like that, the way things are heading. So is it going to be people on the streets marching? It doesn't really look like that. Are the students going to come out in the summer? It doesn't feel like that. So where's it going to come from? I don't think it's artists. Artists go and do their own thing. Artists are very selfish, not, you know, in an unpleasant way. We can only really tell their own personal story and their interpretation of it. So
I'd say also just...
I didn't say you're selfish, by the way.
Well, no,
there's you know
something...
what I mean?
There's something... Well, I think even in the most benign way of telling it, you know, often as artists, you're quite aware that you're preaching to the converted. Yeah. You know, your audiences are already probably socially conscious, you know, slightly left-leaning, people who care enough to kind of come to a talk like this. And it's how do you get those messages out? I mean, it really is, you know, and it is, we were talking about this over lunch, it took Attenborough doing Plastics and Blue Planet 2 for the Daily Mail to get behind it. And obviously the Daily Mail gets behind it, and everyone's suddenly, we must stop the plastics. And it's like, as you say, it's something we were working on for a long time before, not to blow our own trumpets, but it's like, there's lots of these conversations where, I sort of will go and, it's not research anymore because it is horror. I mean, I will go and have conversations with a few people in the field, and I'll come away wanting to scream, and it's this very odd sense of culpability and responsibility. And, one of the reasons I sort of really took on this mammoth project was because I have kids, but now I find I don't spend as much time with my kids because I'm running off to speak to somebody about the ocean in somewhere far-flung place. So it's I think it's this perpetual thing of how do we operate as subjects? How do we do our best given the different factors that are around us? And I think you put it rightly. There's previous apocalypses. Air pollution is back to being an issue through diesel, which they were encouraging not long ago. But if we think about air pollution, toxic air pollution from factories, and the smog that used to be in most of the cities, when we were burning coal, it's.
I think I did quite a lot of work with Greenpeace, and their strategy is quite simple: is to show the horror, really show the fact, and frighten people into action. And it's very powerful, and it's the right thing given their resources, is to, if you like, it's positive action. But all the kind of research or the stuff that I learned from being involved with environmental companies and organisations is that if you can show the positives, like the example of a rewilded area where suddenly things are coming through, or beautiful sedum roofs in the city, or how nature can come back. The example of these areas we're talking about of the ocean that have now been made into sort of mini national parks, and how quickly things come back. When you actually show people these positives, it's amazing how you can counter that apocalyptic feel, because you see it, believe it. And you can put horror messages up, and there's so many horror messages at the moment, and the population has become totally immune to pictures of, children after chlorine attacks in Syria and everything, because we've just become immune to reacting to that. But if you can show that there is hope and there are positive examples, I think that's one of the ways. It's one of the few times I start to feel positive when I see examples of people doing things on a small scale, and you see examples of things coming back. And
it sounds like you're talking about some sort of organic resistance in a way.
Well, I think that may have to be it. Yeah. I mean, I was looking at pictures of Chernobyl the other day, and the horror. But what's now? I've been working out if I can get there. Get a license to go and film, and will I be safe?
Yeah.
And
I know one artist who did that.
But just
I can put you in touch.
But how nature, go online and look at how nature's come back in Chernobyl, and then you've got, some new architects come and say, why don't we make new cities like this that are as green as this? And, we live in tower blocks with plants and flowers and grow our own herbs inside the buildings. It's totally possible. In fact, the only people doing this are the Chinese. It's extraordinary. The Chinese, both more coal-powered stations, but they're also inviting Richard Rogers, and Norman Foster and these people to go and create these sustainable cities. And the best examples of hope in terms of urban futures is actually Chinese cities, where they're taking 100% renewable, sustainable cities. And that's not coming from a democratic system. And there's lots of horror in China, I know, human rights, but there are examples of, our ideas that you can start to see, well, there may be a brighter future.
Well, I was going to say, actually, I was thinking of China as well, because, it's very bizarre that China has gone from being like one of the worst polluters to the strongest supporters of the Kyoto Protocols. Yeah. And really, when you start to sort of look at why that is, it's because a lot of Central Committee members were seeing the effects of pollution on themselves and their children. So the fact that it's centralised and not democratic meant that something could be done. So that was, and it was something I was researching when I was in the earlier phase about researching democracy and trying to look at it in different contexts and sort of pragmatically based upon the sort of the facts. And it's like, okay, as you say, there's all sorts of other things. I wouldn't necessarily want to, live under certain, human rights and freedom of speech regimes, but at least on this aspect of sort of pollution, they were able to very quickly almost do a 180.
I mean, can you imagine this government actually saying, right, we're going to take a whole city outside of Birmingham and we're going to make it 100% sustainable in 15, 20 years. That's the plan. We'll take 3 cities and not one bit of carbon pollution can be there. It's totally 100% sustainable. Food production, energy use, everything. You just can't, it would never happen in the current system. So maybe, we need some kind of planned economy, organisations getting together. At the moment, Trump and wealthy billionaires are breaking these institutions down because it serves their purpose. It means that they can keep taking oil out for longer, and it means they can, introduce GM crops and everything. I mean, a short aside about the horror and frighten is, I am an environmentalist, but I'm not a brave environmentalist. I entered a photographic competition for Syngenta. I was sent this huge
Canadian.
They're Swiss, American, Canadian. They make GM and they make the pesticides that are killing our bees, apparently. Just in case they were watching. And I saw, I thought, I better just check out Syngenta. And I rang up Greenpeace, rang up the Soil Association. Lord Melcher, worked with it. And I found out, no, they're actually the people making the neonicotinoids and everything. I thought, right, so I contacted the organisers of the competition, Candlestar, who worked with the Tates, do a lot of, and said, you do know about Syngenta, don't you, this competition? And, they're backing, and they kind of didn't answer me. And then I sent a few more emails, and then the answer said, no, we're happy with it. So I started sending photographs of dead bees as my entrance. And the day after, my website went down, completely dismantled. And I thought, this has to be a coincidence. And I asked my web designer, I said, no, someone's dismantling it. And the shivers went up my spine and said, I don't believe it was Candlestar, So this is what we're up against. Some of these companies are very powerful and would do anything. And I accept it frightened me off. At every talk I do mention this and try and persuade photographers to not to enter. But I was at a talk, I won't say where recently, and the head of photography at that school was one of the judges on the board. And I've known him all my life. So it's frightening. That's who small artists we're up against, corporate money, and it can get, it's difficult, it can get depressing.
So can you find a solution as an artist?
Shezad?
I think it's a very, very tough one because as an artist you are so atomized in that way. You haven't got the support of anyone at all, except people who are maybe friendly and sympathetic to your work in terms of curators, other artists, and to try and be sustainable as an artist and fund your practice, which sometimes asks difficult questions. It's not easy, especially when some of the people who might fund the work are actually, you're actually coming at it from opposite ends of the ethical spectrum, and that becomes, problematic, to say the least. So
a lot of negotiation is...
A lot of negotiations, sometimes negotiations with yourself. I mean, just being absolutely candid, sometimes I take the money and think I'm being Robin Hood-like because I'm taking the money and repurposing it at odds with the people who are giving it to me. And sometimes I don't take it because I feel it's too much of a compromise. And I think it's, I'd like to,
It's a massive philosophical issue at the moment for artists. Do you take the money or don't for a project? We look at BP and the Tate. And I've been in some huge debates with really good friends and artists who, we've almost not split up over these things, the debate, but we've had huge debates. And for me, I was in a show a few years ago, and the show was curated by a nation, or an oil nation, and a few people dropped out, but bulk of us didn't. But my view was we should stay in it and we should show the work, as long as it didn't touch the editing of it. There was no influence on the content, then I was happy to go ahead with it. And there wasn't any influence on the content. And on that basis, we thought it was the right thing to do. But there are, as soon as content is influenced, which it would be in a photographic competition because they wouldn't show my dead bees, for example, then an artist can't be involved. But it's always difficult because suddenly you're artists, you're living off really, really small residences and a few sales, and suddenly you're offered a large sum of money to do a project which would, feed you for a couple of years. Do you take it? It's a really difficult issue, I think. Yeah.